Hello, and welcome to, well, will be a slightly different video than what I'd originally planned. Because originally, I recorded this at home. Originally, I had plans of doing all my videos and getting them all done, and then not needing to worry about it. Hello. But, sadly, things don't always work out as we plan. Rather like the Italian Navy and their preparations for war, which were not supposed to happen before 1942, and then, well, Il Duce decided that Hitler must know something he didn't, and he couldn't afford to miss out on what Hitler knew, so he'd go into war with him in 1939, years before they were ready. And the fleet which suffered most from this was the Italian Navy. It's hard to explain how much the Italians had planned on using those 3 years. They were building themselves up, and they were actually probably, of all the Axis powers, the ones carrying out the most sensible build-up. They had the most understanding of what their own limitations were. They had managed through the fact that they were not a dictatorship. As much as Il Duce might claim, they were not as much of a dictatorship as he would have hoped they would be by a long stretch of the imagination. They had managed to actually have an accurate assessment of their capabilities, of their needs, and were building up as best they could to fit them. That's the reality of the Italians. Give them 3 years more, and they would have been a very, very problematic force to deal with. They'd have still been hopefully hopelessly not hopelessly, sorry, outdone and outpositioned, but they would have been far, far harder, and they would have caused far more problems. There again, given 3 years, the British would have accelerated even more with their construction. The French might have actually managed to build something. The Germans would probably have still been stuck pretty much where they were, thanks to their endless desires for completely reimagining what they were going to build every other year, so never actually building anything. Alright, having a lovely load of wonderful dreams of hypotheticals of what you might want, but you actually at some point need to go, right, and that's what we're going to do, and we're going to build enough of them that we can actually use them. Not they are a one-off custom job that, comes out on special occasions after we've properly feather bowed it. Hello. Believe it or not, this is the best place to film, and though it is on the floor, and there is a poodle jumping backwards and occasionally treating me as a mild, gymkhana event. So, that being said, what is the position in 1939-1940 for the Italian force and infrastructure in the Red Sea? Well, they have a lot of good ideas. They do. They have a lot of very interesting ideas and very capable forces in terms of their numbers and what they are theoretically supposed to do. The trouble is, those are all nascent forces. Those are all forces which are the potential for something. And the infrastructure is the potential for something. Okay, what do you want to do? You want to cause trouble for Britain in the Indian Ocean? Yeah, you want to be the only Axis navy which is going to have a viable threat, a viable force presence in the Indian Ocean. Yeah. Great. How are you going to resupply that? That's your first problem. How long are your supplies going to last? Because these things, these ships, they might not look that advanced or complicated to modern eyes. These are, of course, the ships from my own book, so shameless book plug going on here. But they are really advanced for their time period, and they require stores, they require components which are manufactured to within certain tolerances and have to be replaced in order to maintain the level of operation required for combat operations. That requires a logistics training. It requires logistics. It requires stores. Italy starts their operations in the Red Sea and their operations in Eastern Africa with 2 floating dry docks sitting out in Massawa, probably mangling completely. They start with all sorts of infrastructure they've put there, but they don't have a lot of stores. Why? Well, because that was the next set of things they were going to do. It's easier in many ways, especially when you're talking about floating dry docks, to move the infrastructure which you're going to use to support your ships out there than the stores and infrastructure you need to support that infrastructure and make it viable. Yes, infrastructure requires infrastructure. Stores require stores. You want to keep a floating dry dock going, you're going to require stores and fuel for that. All of this stuff is, I wouldn't say necessarily complicated or complex, rather straightforward. You want to do X? Well, for you to do X, machine Y requires the Z list of components, and it requires them all to be working. So you need to have stores of all those things if you want to guarantee its availability. If you don't mind waiting for a 6-month return trip for the order to be sent, the component to be manufactured, and then the component to be dispatched to you, then you don't need the stores. But if you need that system to be working there and then, you need stores to make sure it's working when you need it to be working. And if you're going to be cut off from home, so you can't replace those stores, you need to have stores of stores. And that's the problem. The Italian Empire is... it's grown rapidly, with lots of efforts being put into growing it. But it's, in terms of infrastructure, about an inch deep. There are some really interesting campaigns in North Africa. There's some really interesting campaigns in Eastern Africa in World War II, where at points, people, if you look at it and you go, well, hang on, the British are withdrawing from the Italians. And the British reasoning is why bother fighting them? They're going to run out of supplies, and then we can go back and win without any trouble. Why waste the lives and troops fighting them when they're going to run out of supplies and be able to do nothing? Rather an evil military strategy, but it's a very effective one. And that's what the British are thinking. It's one of those things within months of the war beginning, the Reiga Marina's Flottiglia del Mar Rosso is basically reduced to a fleet in being because of its own supplies. That's it. It's reduced to a fleet in being not by British action, despite that being quite successful, and disturbingly well informed by intelligence assets, as far as the Italians are concerned. But realistically, they are reduced by their own inability to resupply their forces. Okay, there's Massawa. Tre. And if you consider where that is in the Red Sea, if you consider all the things that are going up and down there, that should have been a nightmare of epic proportions for the Royal Navy. 8 submarines? 9 destroyers, some motor torpedo boats, and various auxiliary ships, including auxiliary cruisers and other fun things. That should have been an absolute operational nightmare to the Royal Navy. Because if you can do a mass destroyer motor torpedo boat attack, and there are 2 destroyers which are sometimes grouped in with the motor torpedo boats, but they were built as destroyers and then classified later on as torpedo boats because they're attached to the torpedo boat squadron. I'll get into those in a bit later, but I've included them, broadly speaking, in the destroyer numbers, because that allows me to separate off what is a true motor torpedo boat versus what is a... We're not calling it a destroyer anymore, but, you know, it's not a torpedo. It really shouldn't be called a torpedo boat. That's a scary little force. That should have been able to dominate the Red Sea. And this is the point at which you usually start having conversations with people and people go, well, you know, how did the British respond? Well, for a long part of the war, actually, before the Italians got involved in it, when they thought the Italians would get involved in 1939, there's a tribal destroyer flotilla sitting in the Red Sea, Indian Ocean area. That's why they're there when the Graf Spee is coming north, going, come to us. Come, Graf Spee. And the Graf Spee, unfortunately, didn't go north enough, otherwise it'd run into 8 tribal-class destroyers, who would have given it a very warm welcome. Roughly 40 torpedoes loaded. God knows how many actually carried. 64 4.7-inch guns. And 8 crews, which pretty much are the definition of nail crunchers. Yeah. That would have been a problem for the Graf Spee. But the reason that force was there in the first place was nothing to do with the Graf Spee. It was nothing to do with German surface raiders. It was there because of... It was there for the Italians because they were that much of a potential threat where they were. Then the ships get recalled back to all the home fleet because the Italians aren't in the war. And they take part in Norway. And by the time the Italians join in the war, they're not there, but the British still have a sufficiently large number of forces. Now we have very tall, 6'6" Prince Amedeo, 3rd Duke of Aosta, Amedeo, Umberto, Isabella, Luigi Filippino, Maria Giuseppe Giovanni di Savoia e Aosta. He's a very tall, very imposing gentleman, viceroy, cousin to the king, and a very passionate Italian gentleman. Now, why have I included him in this? Well, there are some small issues that happen in this particular conflict. One of them, I mean, it's a small issue, is that at various points, the viceroy, who is not really, I would consider one of Il Duce's biggest fans. In fact, you can argue he's been made viceroy of that area because it was better for Il Duce that he was a long way away from Italy a long way away from Italy. In fact, how far away can we make him be? We'd really like him a long way away. A long, long way away. Well, he has interesting relations with the various officers in charge. Marino Carlo Balsamo di Specchia Nomade, who will actually, after this posting, will end up, and he's basically the guy who sets up the fleet. He's the person who sets up the Italian formation in the Red Sea. After this posting, and so on, he ends up going to become naval attaché to Japan, and will end up being interned by the Japanese when the Italians switch sides. And he's replaced in post by Rear Admiral Mario Bonetti, who is he has some very good ideas. He also, and I would say this with conviction, is very aware of the realities of his post and is very focused on achieving the maximum result he can achieve. Not necessarily to the benefit of those under his command. I would say I consider some of the orders and instructions he gives, and I realize I am British, so I can be accused of being biased against him because of the fact he was mostly fighting British and Commonwealth forces, and occasionally Free French. But I would say there are sufficiently interesting circumstances, especially when it comes to the latest siege of port and harbour and the forces he has under command him there, under his command there. Sinking ships to block harbour, yes. Stretching the siege out longer than it needs to be and waiting until you've had your lines beaten in by, I think it was the 8th Indian Brigade. You're already surrounded by at least 2 brigades, with more coming up. You have no supply lines, you have no sustainment, no support. I would probably, thinking I couldn't break out from the situation and certainly couldn't get home, would probably have suggested there were better options to me than necessarily trying to fight and withstand a siege. Which is, they don't need to do anything. They've got me bottled up. They can sit there and let me starve. So, this is the real core of his surface fleet. I know he has some auxiliary cruisers, but let's be honest, the core of the surface fleet there are the destroyers. So we have the Francisco Nulo, the Nazaro Saro, the Cesar Battisti, and the Daniele Manin, and they're all Saro class. I wouldn't call them the world's biggest or best destroyers. Certainly wouldn't want to fight a tribal class in them. But, along with the Pantera, Tigre, and Leon, they are a major threat. They are a major threat to your forces you have available to you. And you only have to look at their lines to see this. These are vessels designed for speed, they're designed for maneuverability, they're designed to make sure they get their firing position as accurate as they can do and as close as they can do. Everything about them is orientated around their torpedo stack. They are designed to launch a heavy attack and to make their enemy suffer. So they're more than enough to threaten a convoy. And on paper, they should be incredibly scary. And if you're dealing with someone other than the British, with their overabundance of cruisers wandering around and various various large destroyers, probably these could be really dominant. You also have the Giovanni Asabi and the Vincenzo Orsini, who are older, earlier destroyer types, which have been downrated to torpedo boats to support the torpedo boats. It's not a bad thing. It's actually quite a sensible thing, really. But they do start off in the destroyer world, so I include them under the destroyer heading rather than I do under the torpedo boat heading. What is the flexibility this force offers? Why not have, newer ships? Well, newer ships you need them for escorting a fleet back in the Mediterranean. Newer ships you need elsewhere. So what do you need these ships for? Well, these ships, they started out, some of them as fleet scouts, was their official designation, which is sort of interesting role the Italians had, which was sort of between destroyer and cruiser. Then eventually they'd drop down into destroyer role, rather like these are dropped down from destroyer torpedo role. That means they have range. That means they're fairly good at ocean movements. And let's be honest, the advantage of the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean is that whilst it is certainly not a mill pond, it is far closer to Mediterranean in terms of its operating and its wave heights and movements. Most of the time, and I'm saying most of the time, than in Atlantic is. Far closer. Then we have the submarines. Loosely titled the 8th Submarine Group, divided into 2 squadrons. The Giamatti, Galileo Ferrari, Galileo Galilei, Luigi Galvini, Perla, Maciel, Archimede, and Evangelisto Torselli. And this is, of course, the Perla pictured. And at some point, I have to do a video about the Perla because that's an absolutely amazing story. Her getting back around Africa, all the way to Barcelona is just... And even her story of how she survives almost getting ambushed by the British is pretty darn good. And all 4 that do not have something next to name, they're the ones that survive and get to Barcelona. They go round Africa. Of those 4, Galileo Galilei, Luigi Galvini, Marcel, and Evangelista Torselli don't survive. 3 lost due to enemy action. One of them, Galileo Galilei, is actually captured. And not only will I say Perla's story will be done later, but so will Galvini's. At some point I will do videos about them. And if I forget, if in a few months you're watching this video, let's say after Christmas 2023, and I haven't done those videos, ping a comment on this video and go, Alex, you've forgotten to get round to this. Okay? Thank you. So, now not breaking the 4th wall anymore. The Evangelista Torselli is a very cool submarine. It really is. It's one of the 6 submarines here, which, if you look at this group, about 6 of these you would consider as really being ocean-going vessels. This, by the way, is the Perla pictured. They are good submarines. They are very good submarines for the Italians. And that's something you sort of notice. You look at the Destroyers, you look at everything else, they're sort of older vessels, but the submarines, they're some of their good quality ones. They do have issues, though. Their submarines all have mechanical needs. They're like any submarine in this period. They are, all of them could be classified as experimental by the standards of today if we consider some of the components put in them. But still, submarine technology is still evolving, still developing. Tortoselli, well, she has a nightmare experience. She's out doing her duties, trying to find merchant ships, trying to be problematic, trying to cause trouble. Just what a submarine does in wartime. And she gets found on 23rd of June 1940 by a hunting group composed of HMS Shoreham, a sloop. Pictured. This one. 3 K-class destroyers. HMS Kandahar, she's going to be pictured later in the video. HMS Khartoum, I can't really find a decent picture of her. She did actually later on manage to blow herself up through her own internal explosion. The joys of operating destroyers. The joys of operating any ship which is powered by steam boilers. They all have the ability to blow themselves sky high because, let's be honest, a steam boiler is a barely contained explosion of water and hot gases. And HMS Kingston, pictured here doing some anti-submarine warfare operations actually in the Mediterranean later on. Now, the K-class submarines are closest the Royal Navy has to, in terms of pre-World War II built destroyers, as anti-submarine warfare destroyers, it seems. When you look at their duties, their trainings, and their various operations, they seem to be focused. They're not quite as focused as these puppies are, though. Let's be honest, sloops are the designated sub-killing machines of the Royal Navy. It's rather interesting of this fight exactly who Tortoselli chooses to focus their fire on. They choose, when they are forced to surface, and they do end up having to surface, to carry on fighting, and to focus their fire on Shoreham. Shoreham takes the hits and keeps on fighting back. What can I say? The Italians have very brave submarine commanders. I think if I found myself surfacing in a submarine and I was faced with a sloop and 3 opposition destroyers, all of which have sufficient firepower to disintegrate me, not sure I would be firing my guns. I think at that point I might surrender. But the fact that they survive as long as they do is all based down to one of the crew actually sacrificing his life. You see, Tortoselli ends up with a hole in her after torpedo section, and a crewman blocks the hole with his body. Sacrifices his life to save his crew. And because of that, when they surface and they start firing, and then they eventually get damaged to the point at which they have to abandon the vessel, 31 of them escape. If it hadn't been for the young man who lost his life blocking the hole, none of them would have survived. Then we have Galileo Galilei. Okay. So, she bumps into HMS Moonstone here. T-90, converted trawler, formerly the Lady Madeline. Launched 1934. Not exactly the world's most militant of vessels, but it is a trawler. And trawlers are known throughout World War II as things you don't want to mess with if you're a submarine, because, let's be honest, justifying using a torpedo on a trawler is a hard one, but it's sometimes necessary. However, and I say this politely, doing what Galileo Galilei does is probably even less sensible, because what they do is they think, hang on, we can surface and fight this one out. We've had some depth charges dropped on us with damage. We've got some lovely leaks in our batteries. Okay, we need to surface. We can still win this fight on the surface. We have more guns. We're more powerful than they are. We will win this. Please note this video is titled not this image is titled not the fate of HMS Moonstone, the fate of Galileo Galilei. Because she does this. She starts firing. At which point, someone probably remembers they're a submarine, so they have the firing stability of a corkscrew. I.e., not really that great, and so they miss. However, good old HMS Moonstone here, and let's be honest, if you consider some of their names, there is a good argument for making this calling this the Royal Navy's anti-submarine warfare hippie squadron. But leaving that to one side, they come in close and they keep firing, and they are perfectly stable and able to be used as a gun platform. So yeah, Galileo Galilei ends up surrendering. It's just the thing that often annoys me about these sort of scenarios is that if they'd been allowed the time, or actually if Mussolini had even turned around in 1939 and said, actually, by about halfway through 1940, I'm going to have joined the Allies. So you've got, I'm going to join Hitler in this war. So you've got about 6 months to prepare. They could have maybe rushed out some supplies, maybe rushed out some stores. And you wouldn't have had things like the whole battery system, etc., giving off gases which could wipe out the entire crew, forcing them to surface and try and fight out a surface fight versus a trawler. But that's what happened. You've also noticed that I've only put, of the 4 submarines lost, I've only put 3 down as lost due to enemy action. 1 is entirely lost due to mechanical failure. Entirely used to its own systems killing it from the inside out. That has another brave story involved, where a midshipman and a couple of crew sail a little dinghy to go get help to come and retrieve the crew from an island. It's an absolutely amazing little story. But the fact they even have to do it worries me. It's a waste. It can be argued all war is a waste of life. All war is a waste of resources. And it's really a hard argument to really argue against. As necessary as war sometimes is to deal with evils in this world. But sending people to fight and die in an exposed position where they are not able to be supported, resupplied, or in any way furnished with the necessities they need to actually conduct operations in a timely, capable, and professional manner that is most likely to both preserve life and give valuable effect for whatever loss of life to at least make it have some meaning in terms of the wider war effort. To me, that deserves its own special ring in hell. Go to torpedo boats. So, the 21st MAS Squadron. MAS 204 lost due to mechanical failure. MAS 206 lost due to mechanical failure. MAS 210 lost due to mechanical failure. MAS 213 scuttled 8th April 1941. MAS 216 lost due to mechanical failure. Yes, there is a theme going on here. Theme is they don't even have the supplies necessary to keep their torpedo boats running. The simplest and most straightforward of all their weapon systems. They don't even have the supplies. It's terrible. These are some really cool vessels, and they achieve some really amazing things, including HMS Cape Town. Now, please note, that's 213. And she achieves that on the 6th of April 1941. And she is scuttled on the 8th of April 1941 due to damages sustained. But also due to them making various decisions about the likelihood of them actually getting out alive. Or rather, let's get rid of these ships before they are taken by the enemy. HMS Cape Town is a C-class cruiser of the Royal Navy. Yes, she's being used for convoy escort and general support operations, and is not a frontline cruiser in any way, shape, or form. In fact, if you want a good example of what happens when a frontline cruiser turns up, this force when it's... Sorry, the poodle's just decided he's a guard dog. No, there's no one here. Come on. Down. Quiet. Down. Raleigh. Down. Down. Excuse me. Raleigh. Here. Raleigh. So well behaved. Here. Come here. Sorry. So, HMS Cape Town was a C-class cruiser. She was a useful ship. Not frontline. And as said, when they did bump into a frontline cruiser, a HMZS Leander, before she was HMNZS Leander, but they did bump into her, they didn't have a good experience. They sent their forces out, and it turned out it was a convoy escorted by her and some destroyers, and basically the Italian force went, "Oh, frigate, they've got a lot of firepower." Which is ultimately is the problem here. In that the Royal Navy in many ways spends the 1920s and 30s preparing to fight a global war and preparing to fight a war where their trade was going to be attacked, and they were usually counting on being outnumbered when attacked. The Italians don't spend the 1920s and 30s preparing to fight that war against the British. They basically get this idea after their conquest of certain parts of Africa, and they then go, "Ooh, we have a good idea. This is how we're going to use our forces." And they start to build up the infrastructure to do it. But they don't yet really have the ships yet to do it. They don't really have they don't really have the stores to do it. They've just got the idea. And you can look at that again when you see this force. They have oil tankers, water tankers. These are useful ships. These water tankers, there are 3 of them. They're not things you necessarily want to lose. Again, if you think about it, if the Reiga Marina Italiana had a knowledge of what was coming, might they not have moved some of these ships back home? The mine layer Ostia is lost with a full... She's got her racks full of mines, and she's attacked by the Royal Air Force. The Ram 1, well, she has a bump into with a certain Leander, and doesn't go well. Some of the vessels even managed to bump into a heavy cruiser. HMS Cornwall, an 8-inch county cruiser, manages to bump into Penguin, definitely arguably one of the most successful German surface raiders of World War II, if not the most successful one. And it's operating in that region. Why? Because the Germans had thought they might be able to get some support from the Italians. only to realise that the Italians don't even have enough to support themselves, let alone anyone else. And why is there a county-class cruiser wandering around? Why is there other vessels wandering around that area? Primarily, not because of German surface raiders. Yes, German surface raiders are a threat, and they are a problem, and they do appear in random places and cause issues. However, the real threat sitting in there on paper in the Indian Ocean, on the eastern African coast, is the Italian Navy. Specifically Ram 1 and Ram 2, I suppose, considering their wider formations. But yeah, they're the threats. They are the threats which are being considered, and the threats which are being focused on. Anyway, let's consider comes next. So what had been the Italian plans? Well, look at all this trade. You will have seen, if you've seen some of my other videos, especially ones about Britain's global strategy and various other the global strategy stuff. Normally, I produce some of these plans, whether they are from any of the surveys the Royal Navy does in the 1930s of global trade, where merchant ships over a certain tonnage, i.e. the big merchant ships, the ones that the Royal Navy actually cares about, are in the world, how many are there around the world, where there's transitioning, and basically it's a very simple map to read. The ones where you see more dots are a greater collection of ships. And often they also have, these whole sets of dots together, which are how many ships are in a harbour. What's an average of the number of ships in that harbour? And you look at the Red Sea and you go, oh my, that's a choke point. The Suez Canal is vital. Okay, and how much of that trade is British going backwards and forwards? How much of that is French? How much of that is absolutely insanely important to the British Empire? A lot of it. Now, at this point, you could turn around and go, but Alex, with the Mediterranean position of the Italian fleet, the Reiga Marina already cut that off. The Reiga Marina already mean that trade cannot go past really the Suez Canal zone. It can't cross through the Mediterranean, the quickest route to home. It has to go around Africa. You are right. You are 100% right. But this is the small issue. But the British can still supply the Suez Canal area. And the Reiga Marina understand. The High Command understands. They're the ones, by the way, who are leading and supporting the army as well, who are also supporting it, turning around to Mussolini and going, we do not want to go to war right now. We need at least 3 more years of preparation. You promised us 3 more years of preparation. Why? Because this position is great if you want to try and cut off Alexandria, the Suez Canal area from getting resupplies from outside. If you can cut off those supplies for a few months, burn through the British supplies, you might be able to run whatever fleet the British have in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean down to a point at which it is functionally non-viable. Think about that. We spent this whole video so far talking about what happens to the Italian fleet because they go functionally non-viable because of lack of stores and supplies. Yes, the British have more stores and supplies. Oh my lord, have the British built up a load of stores and supplies. Again, one of the things that's often forgotten, and one of the things that's often misunderstood about what the British Armed Forces are spending a lot of their money on, in this period but to this day, is usually stores and supplies. Now, You can argue whether you have enough stores and supplies today. You could argue whether you had enough stores and supplies then. But the fact is, you had a depth of resource available, a depth of these things to keep going. You had the infrastructure required to keep your infrastructure going. But even that is not inexhaustive. Even that requires resupply. And this is what this offers the Italians, especially if they could somehow link up overland. That sounds a strange thing, but again, think about that. Think about where the Italian North Africa Empire is. Think about the areas of land in between those spaces. Yes, they might be red on the map. They might be British Empire. They might even be French. But they're mostly desert with a few oases, and they are not exactly the most infrastructure laden areas for anyone to try and project power into. If a railway or a road had actually been built, the odds are it would have been interesting, to say the least, in terms of trying to interdict it. It would have been possible, and honestly, with the sheer amount of forces the British had at their disposal, probably would have been interdicted. But the fact is, there is a chance. There is an option. There is a logic going on to that thinking. So plans are disruption. Plans are heavily defended convoys. They're going to get attacked by submarines and destroyers and aircraft. They're going to have the full gamut thrown at them. Lightly defended vessels are probably going to just get submarines engaging them. And torpedo boats will make sure that none of them have trouble with anyone following them too closely. That's the plan. And it's not necessarily a bad plan. This, again, it's not a bad plan. It could work. It really could. But, this is the point again, you need to be able to sustain it to make it work. You need to be able to sustain that plan. You need to be able to sustain those operations. That's the really big issue we're talking about, sustainment of operations. You see, the Italians have good ideas. They really do. But sustaining those ideas, well, they know what they need to do to be able to build up and sustain them is time. There you go. There you have the reality. HMS Kandahar towing Galileo Galilei after a capture by HMS Moonstone. And why is she captured? Well, she has a couple of depth charges dropped on her, but that shouldn't be enough to really cause her too much trouble. But it is enough to force her to surface. Because she has dangerous gases building up and they'll probably die underwater. Then they surface. And then, I know I talked about the hull corkscrewing and the sort of bobbing, has the stability of a corkscrew sort of thing. If everything had worked as it should do, they should have still had a chance. Fairly decent chance of hitting their target. But they didn't. They missed completely wildly. And they were taking so long to reload. And that's when you start to think about things properly. Because you start to go, well, hang on, why are they taking so long to reload? What's happening? What's going on with this crew? They're already affected by the poison? How much training have they been able to do? Because spare parts not only affects your ability to fight, but affects your ability to train. Because training wears through your components as well. And if you don't train properly, then you're never going to be able to use it actually in combat. And you have to train a lot. Especially if you're going to use things in highly dangerous scenarios like you're using them from a submarine. this was a pretty good moment for the Royal Navy. This is a very good submarine. You're taking, not just taking off the board in terms of sinking it, you're capturing it. Yes, it's technically towed back by Kandahar because Moonstone really isn't capable of towing it. She tries. But even in the relatively calm waters we're talking about here, it was better to have a destroyer on the other end of the tow cable. And Galileo Galilei had fairly successful crews at that point. She'd already attacked and sunk a merchant vessel. She'd caused damage to ships ships moving around. She'd caused ships to reorient, to change their movement because of what she was doing. She was doing successful operations, and then she gets caught. There is the surface radar paradox that's been talked about. In that surface radar paradox is that surface radars are often something which is sought by the weaker power to try and offset and diffuse the stronger naval power's capabilities to maneuver their forces. However, the paradox is also that the very nature of the surface radar means that because it is unsupported, it is a glass jaw the whole time. As powerful as it looks, as big and powerful, as scary as it can be, it's got all these big guns. The moment it gets damaged in any way, shape, or form, it's got nowhere to go get repaired. It's got no sustainment. So it doesn't require much effort to render it a mission kill. The Red Sea Flotilla is forward basing. The Red Sea Flotilla is positioned forward in order to provide Reiga Marina with the reach they need to be able to really deliver on what they want to do. It's about having that capacity for great power status in terms of where they can project power to. But, and this despite them not having any vessels which really represent the surface radar ideal of being this big powerful ship, or this big powerful weapons. There's certainly nothing that would justify deployment of HMS Renown or anything like that to deal with them. They are prone to the same weakness. They're a glass jaw. But their glass jaw isn't the fact they haven't got anywhere to go and repair themselves. They've got that. It's just they have nothing to repair themselves with once they get there. So, maybe not so much a glass jaw as, I don't know, a cotton supply line. Actually, cotton's quite strong despite being small, isn't it? Yeah. They're just, there's no real way to describe it. So was it worth it? You have to consider the forces they tie down. What could they be used elsewhere? That's always the question I ask students when I'm talking it through. What other forces could have been used elsewhere if they hadn't been there? The odds are the C-class cruisers, etc. would have still been around because there would have still been German surface raiders wandering around, and a C-class can deal with pretty much any surface raider. I know there were some incidents and some German surface raiders that really did manage some absolutely amazing feats against some vessels. But, especially the most famous one of those, we'll probably never really know the truth of what happened there. And we never really know what was going through anyone's heads, although I've done videos about them. But basically, a C-class cruiser can deal with most threats of most surface raiders, barring a Panzer Chief. And if there's a Panzer Chief around, there's usually bigger things coming around going out. They're going, hello, have you seen our friendly Panzer Chief? We're here to give them a welcome. So the C-class cruisers still be there. What about the destroyers? Tribal-class destroyers, especially at the beginning of the war, probably would not have been deployed. If it hadn't been for the Reiga Marina forces there, no reason to have them leave the Mediterranean. They're probably still in the Mediterranean. They might even be at the Gibraltar end of the Mediterranean in case they needed up in that direction. Does that have a big impact on the beginning of World War II? Probably not. But it would still be useful to have them closer for earlier operations. It could have had an impact on some things. It could have meant vessels were available. And the other thing you've got is sloops being used there. Would the sloops still be there? Probably not. And the K-class destroyers? Probably not. And if you think, well, if they'd been available elsewhere, what could they have been doing? Would they have been with HMS Courageous, perhaps? When she was doing her anti-submarine warfare operations. Which, by the way, the Royal Navy also had HMS Ark Royal doing along with her. So, yeah. Royal Navy knows carriers are useful for anti-submarine warfare. They know and they consider them important for anti-submarine warfare. The Royal Navy also doesn't have enough smaller carriers, so they're using their fleet carriers for the role. Not necessarily the best decision in the world. Definitely not the smartest. But sorry, camera on keeps flashing up below at the bottom of the screen, and I'm wondering what's happening. But we'll see that. But was it worth it? Yes. Because when you think about what the forces the British had deployed there were, and how they could have been used, whilst they wouldn't have had any major impact, their cumulative effect could have been quite interesting. Their cumulative presence of having those extra dozen or so destroyers available in various other places is useful. It builds up. Having vessels like HMS Shoreham, etc. available, useful. Builds up. Things like HMS Cape Town not getting damaged, not needing over a year in Bombay, builds up. These are ships which aren't massive on their own. They're not a massive utility that's going to make, another aircraft carrier, fast battleship. They're nothing like that, which is going to go, you can sort of think about it and go, well, hang on. What's that going to free up? Those things all have value, though. They all build up. They all have a cumulative effect, because maybe you have another destroyer in a task force and they spot the submarine earlier, or because of their positioning, or you have more patrol vessels wandering around Scarpa Flow, and so Royal Oak doesn't get sunk. All these things are options if you don't have to cover this deployment. We don't know where the ships would have been instead. The odds are they'd have been somewhere. And then you have to put it out with the Italians. What use would these vessels been with the Italians? Well, the odds are they wouldn't lose 50% of their submarine strength quite that quickly. Would a mine-laying vessel be useful? Probably they could think of a few things to use that. Your auxiliary cruisers, etc., and gunboats and those things, they build up, they're useful. Going over to Japan in the case of Ram 2, but not really going to have a massive impact on terms of naval warfare for the Italians in the Mediterranean. However, water carriers, fuel ships, those all will have an impact when you consider sustaining operations in North Africa and the convoys they have to run backwards and forwards, and supplies they have to move around. Again, with the destroyers, they individually are not the greatest, the latest, greatest, best ships available for the Reiga Marina. But would they have been more useful at home? This is where the things become interesting. For the Italians, honestly, the deployment of this force represents a far larger commitment of assets than it does for the Royal Navy in response. And conversely, whilst it is definitely worth it from the perspective of what it ties up in terms of the Royal Navy and the effect it has on them, it can be argued to not have been worth it from the point of view of what they lost and how quickly they lost it for the Italians. Because you're not just losing the ships, you're also losing the crews. You're losing all that experience. You're losing all their capabilities, and those things all add up. And yes, you have defeated the Perla and other vessels, and that is frigging amazing. It really is. But and this is something to consider, what more could the Italian Navy have done if they'd had those ships back with the main fleet? How many more convoys could they have escorted? How would those crews have been used? The torpedo boats, we know how useful they turn out to be in World War II. Those 5 extra torpedo boats, those crews, they're a resource. Those extra 9 destroyers, or whatever you want to call them by that point, they're a resource. They are 9 extra vessels that you can use for escorting your fleet, moving your vessels, your operations around. The fuel supplies you've stationed over there, which were not much, could have allowed you to do another major operation in the Mediterranean. Ultimately, this is the question for today, really, to answer. And I hope this video has been good. I apologize now if the computer I've recorded it on a laptop using OBS. On the first time I've done a recording using OBS on the laptop. And I'm not sure how well it's done. I'm not sure how well it's all sustained. I'm going to have time to edit it, check it, and then I will have to drive to probably a Starbucks to upload it. So, yeah, I'm probably not going to be able to check this video as much as I normally do before it goes live. So I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope I'm not doing the whole time or something weird. But the question for today. Question. Simple one. If you had been the Italians, what would you have done? Do you consider the deployment of the flotilla to the Red Sea useful? Or do you think... And the question I'm going to give you is basically, you have a heads up in January 1940 that the plan is to do that. plan is to join the war effort as soon as possible. What do you do as commander of the Reiga Marina? Do you withdraw the ships and the vessels and the vessels as quickly as you can to the Mediterranean? Do you reinforce? You send supply ships through? What do you do? Thank you very much for watching. Currently, I haven't scheduled a live for the 17th because that's the final day of driving. But if I'm home, awake, and everything's organized enough, and I am not dealing with any issues at home that require my attention, and I've noticed that, hang on, after disturbing me earlier a lot, I have a missing. I spotted him. Poodle. There might be a live. There might be a cruise ships questions one, probably. Because there have been a lot of interesting naval history stuff in the last week or so coming up. And there are some things on the 17th which are quite cool. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.